Detectives believe Sandra Pagniano was alive and suffered in a grave before she died. One of the lead detectives says, though there is some comfort in justice, this crime is impossible to process and impossible to forget. Replaying what happened to Sandra Pagniano is a painful thought for the detective who stood at the crime scene this time not long ago.
What could drive a man to bury his own wife alive in a hand-dug grave? In May 2017, as Sandra Pagniano sought freedom through divorce, her husband was plotting something far more sinister than a legal battle. The 39-year-old mother of two disappeared without a trace until investigators made a discovery that would reveal one of the most calculated acts of domestic violence Arizona had ever seen. What they found wasn't just evidence of murder, but of a horrifying final experience no one should ever endure. What does it mean to be buried alive? For Sandra Pagniano, this wasn't just a hypothetical horror scenario discussed in late-night conversations or portrayed in thriller movies. It was her reality, her final, terrifying experience on Earth. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you. In May 2017, investigators made a grim discovery that would haunt them for years to come. Hidden in a remote area approximately 10 miles northwest of the family home near Prescott, Arizona, lay Sandra's body in a shallow grave. But what the medical examiner discovered next sent ripples of horror through even the most seasoned detectives on the case. Sandra hadn't died before being placed in that earthen prison. She was alive when the soil began covering her body. The forensic evidence told a story more disturbing than anything investigators had encountered before. Sandra's body showed unmistakable signs of a desperate struggle that had taken place within the confines of the grave itself. Her wrists and mouth had been bound with packing tape, a cruel detail that amplified the horror of her final moments. Despite these restraints, she had fought fiercely for her life. According to the medical examiner's report, Sandra may have remained conscious for up to 5 minutes after being buried. 5 minutes of absolute terror, of lungs burning for air, of darkness pressing in from all sides. The soil beneath her fingernails told investigators that she had scratched and clawed in desperate attempts to free herself, her body instinctively fighting against the inevitability of her situation. The grave itself revealed critical evidence about the perpetrator. This wasn't a hasty, impulsive crime. The hand-dug grave had been meticulously prepared days before the murder took place. Someone had selected this spot, traveled there specifically, and spent considerable time digging the hole that would become Sandra's final resting place. The level of premeditation stunned even veteran investigators. Forensic soil analysis confirmed that the grave had been dug several days prior to Sandra's disappearance, indicating that her murderer had been planning this horrific act well in advance. The careful selection of the burial site, far from any hiking trails or roads, appeared deliberately calculated to ensure no one would hear Sandra's cries during her final moments. The location itself spoke volumes about the killer's intentions. The remote rural setting, miles from the nearest residence, meant that even if Sandra had managed to remove her restraints and call out, her pleas would have echoed uselessly across the empty Arizona landscape. Her murderer had ensured complete isolation during what would be the most terrifying experience imaginable. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they realized they were dealing with something beyond the typical homicide. This wasn't a crime of passion or a split-second decision. This was methodical, calculated, the work of someone who wanted not just to end Sandra's life, but to maximize her suffering in her final moments. The forensic evidence painted a horrifying picture. A 39-year-old mother of two young daughters had experienced the terror of being buried alive while fully conscious, fighting for her life until her final breath. Her body told the story her voice no longer could. The desperate struggle, the terror, and the crushing realization that there would be no escape. Behind every buried body lies a buried truth. As investigators pieced together Sandra's final days, they discovered something far more disturbing than the grave itself. Evidence that her husband had been planning her death with the same methodical precision one might use to plan a family vacation. The digital breadcrumbs he left behind would ultimately expose the calculated nature of his betrayal. The Pagniano home had become a psychological battlefield. Sandra and David were separated but still sharing the same roof, their marriage dissolving while they navigated the complicated logistics of parenting their 2 young daughters. For Sandra, divorce represented freedom. For David, it represented loss of control, a reality he refused to accept. When a spouse initiates divorce proceedings, statistics show it can be the most dangerous moment in a relationship with a controlling partner. What most people don't realize is that separation doesn't always mean safety. It often triggers escalation. This critical period when a victim attempts to regain independence frequently coincides with the most extreme acts of violence, as the controlling partner faces the ultimate loss of power. David's reaction to the divorce was not acceptance but calculation. As investigators would later discover, his phone records told a damning story. Cell phone location data placed David's phone near the remote burial site days before Sandra disappeared, evidence that he had methodically selected and prepared the location in advance. This digital tracking provided investigators with crucial timeline evidence showing premeditation rather than a crime of passion. But David's plan extended beyond just taking Sandra's life. After her disappearance, he executed phase 2 of his scheme, creating a false narrative about her voluntary departure. 2 notes suddenly appeared in the divorce case file, supposedly written by Sandra herself. These documents contained a convenient confession that she was willingly abandoning her family and relinquishing all claims to their shared property. The notes granted David ownership of their vehicles and house, the lead investigator would later explain, describing how the documents established a suspicious windfall that immediately raised red flags. The timing and content of these notes didn't align with a mother who had been deeply committed to her children and determined to start a new life. Forensic document examiners conducted a meticulous analysis of the handwriting, examining the letter formation, slant, pressure, and spacing. Their expertise revealed what investigators had suspected. The notes were forgeries. Through careful examination of these characteristics, forensic experts could determine that David, not Sandra, had authored the notes, crafting a false narrative about her voluntary departure. The digital evidence continued to mount against David. His cell phone again pinged in the vicinity of the burial site on the night of Sandra's disappearance, placing him directly at the scene during the critical time frame. This technology, which most people carry without a second thought, became a silent witness to his movements, contradicting his fabricated alibi. The investigators had uncovered a disturbing truth. David Pagniano had approached murder as a project to be managed. He had scouted the location, dug the grave in advance, executed the killing, and then attempted to create a paper trail suggesting Sandra had chosen to leave. The level of planning revealed a chilling determination that Sandra's attempt to free herself from their marriage would become her death sentence instead. For most killers who spend years crafting elaborate denials, confession comes only when the evidence becomes overwhelming. What makes the Pagniano case particularly unsettling isn't just how he murdered his wife, but what his sudden change of heart revealed about the minds of men who would rather bury their partners alive than let them leave. The Yavapai County Attorney's Office had assembled a formidable case against David Pagniano. Prosecutors were so confident in their evidence that they pursued the ultimate punishment, death by execution. County Attorney Dennis McGrain didn't mince words when explaining their decision, citing the horrific circumstances surrounding the abduction and murder of a young mother as justification for seeking capital punishment. For 7 long years following Sandra's murder, David maintained a wall of denial. While he sat in custody, prosecutors methodically built their case piece by piece, gathering forensic evidence, digital data, and expert testimony. The mountain of evidence portrayed a man whose controlling behavior had escalated to its deadliest conclusion when his wife tried to reclaim her independence. Arizona law treats certain types of murder with particular severity. The method David chose, burial while conscious, wasn't just murder. It represented what prosecutors classified as exceptional cruelty under state statutes. The terror Sandra experienced in those final moments underground became a central argument for pursuing the harshest possible sentence. As the trial date loomed closer, David Pagniano found himself facing not just the evidence against him, but also 12 jurors who would soon decide his fate. The prosecution had laid out a timeline of his movements, exposed his forgeries, and reconstructed the horrifying final moments of Sandra's life. With the weight of evidence crushing his denial, something finally broke within him. In a surprising development that stunned even veteran courthouse observers, David abruptly changed course. After nearly a decade of maintaining his innocence, he suddenly admitted to the murder. But this wasn't a typical plea deal. David pleaded guilty without securing any agreement that might have softened his punishment. He placed his fate entirely in the hands of the judge, a risky gambit when facing potential execution. What drives a man to finally confess after years of calculated lies? Some criminal psychologists suggest that the prospect of having one's crimes laid bare before the public with all the disturbing details and planning exposed becomes too much to bear. Others point to the crushing weight of maintaining elaborate falsehoods year after year. For David, perhaps the realization that 12 impartial jurors would likely condemn him to death row finally shattered his facade. The judge, having reviewed the full scope of evidence and the calculated nature of the crime, delivered justice on May 9th. David Pagniano, now 62, received a life sentence without any possibility of parole for the murder of his wife. The court added an additional 16.5 years for the accompanying crimes of kidnapping, forgery, and fraud. The sentence ensured that David would spend every remaining day of his life behind prison walls, ultimately dying in confinement just as he had forced upon Sandra. Sandra Pagniano's tragic murder isn't just a crime statistic. It's a sobering reminder of the lethal consequences when control is prioritized over human life. Behind the headlines of this horrific case lies an urgent message about the deadly risks women face when attempting to leave abusive relationships. Experts emphasize that victims of domestic violence must create comprehensive safety plans before taking steps to leave. This includes identifying safe places to seek refuge, preparing an emergency bag with essential documents and necessities, and establishing a network of people to call when danger escalates. The most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship often comes when a victim attempts to reclaim their independence. For those trapped in similar situations, specialized resources exist that can mean the difference between life and death. Domestic violence hotlines, emergency shelters, and legal advocacy services operate specifically to guide victims through the treacherous process of separation. These resources provide not just physical safety, but also the emotional support needed to break free from the cycle of abuse before it culminates in tragedy.